Hey, welcome. We are live here on this webinar for writing your book, Getting to Done. And this is the second in a series of webinars that my good friend and colleague Paul and I are doing, uh, focused on the process of getting through the long sometimes and involved and maybe confusing process of writing a book. We talked about planning last time. Today we're going to focus in on writing and some really great strategies to get your thoughts out onto paper. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks. Great to be here, Jason. And as you and I were discussing prior to getting on, I really like the analogy you've put forward of moisture gathering to form clouds that eventually becomes precipitation. Because if we can get that part right, the writing process can actually be very easy. As a professional writer, as a ghostwriter, I come across a lot of people who complain about writer's block and they really don't know the origins of it. Well, today we're going to dive in. We're going to explain some of the origins, or at least I think you're going to see them from all the details that we point out that may sound like an awful lot, but if you do the homework up front, those details become less and less murky, less and less ambiguous, more and more clear. And as my friend Dennis Volpe likes to say, stark clarity destroys ambiguity. And so that's what we're after today.
Absolutely. Now, before we dive into this, I want to get out of the way. Why are we here? And from my part, I'll begin. You helped me write a book, and that was recently published. And I like I talked about before with you, I've started and stopped manuscripts for well over a decade, and a lot of experience has gone into getting that book finally onto paper and getting published. But I'd done public speaking, I'd done blog posts, I had put together workshops and done keynote speeches. But it seemed that the process of getting an entire book manuscript together seemed insurmountable. And you helped me work that process through. And then I said, hey, you know what? Uh, we should probably provide this information to other people because I cannot possibly be the only one. And we've proven this right. So tell us, why are you qualified to have this webinar with me?
Well, aside from having done it myself, right? So I was a gifted writer from an early age, but I had a lot of learning process to go through myself. And one of the later stage learning processes I went through was publishing my first book, which debuted to great acclaim among the 50 or so people who knew me well and appreciated me and recognized and appreciated my talents from years of networking. But as soon as I got it in front of people who didn't know me, it fell absolutely flat. I got nothing. I experienced similar responses, shall we say, absent the power of a good marketing strategy, which I had on my second book, which became a bestseller. But when it was strictly up to me and it wasn't people who knew me, it was actually quite difficult to get people to want to pay attention to my book. And so I began asking the question, what does cause people to pick up a book by an author that they don't necessarily know? And while you can't account for every single subjective criteria that might pop up, when it comes to a business oriented book where you are trying to move a persuasive message that steers the reader in a particular direction, there are a number of guideposts you can follow pretty reliably that will get you the outcome you want, even if the person you're giving that book to or selling it to doesn't know you that well. And so that's what I endeavored to become proficient in. And then when I became proficient in it, I found that people were raising their hands and asking, "Can you help me with that?" And I said, "Yes, I can." And so away it went, and my agency has done several books over the last couple of years. I've coached you and others through writing their own. And I've become a lot more prepared for the next one that I am slowly beginning to research on now that I'd like to release probably in 2024 or so. So it's all that to say, um, I'm here to disperse a bunch of the knowledge that I've accumulated, and I find it really blends well with your perspective, coming from the background that you do.
And one of the most interesting things for me, as part of this process of working with you, particularly around even creating this webinar, is we're following our own advice. We're eating our own dog food. And again, this is not our first rodeo. I've written a lot of stuff before. You've written books, and I know a lot about technology and how to pull this kind of stuff together. But as we've been working through this process, we're actually gathering, I think, some tried and true principles and then blending them in some unique ways to be able to accelerate the process of getting a book to market or getting any content to market. And I'm excited about going through those things as we. I want to do a quick recap from where we were for our viewers and listeners who are new to this webinar. We talked about planning last time, so I want to do a quick recap on that, just so everybody understands where we came from. So I think one of the first things we talked about was, why do you want to write a book? I'm not a believer that a book is for everybody, but a book might be for a lot of people. And one of the key indicators I think of that is, do you have a story to tell that it's just like sitting in your soul? You want to get it out to the world. That's going to be your why. The other thing is, and this is what we're talking about today in particular, is for a nonfiction writer, do you want to sell something? Does the book somehow concentrate readers to enlighten them on some additional value that moves them along some sort of sales process? So really be clear on why you want to write your book. The second thing we talked about was our support system. We broke it down into champions, supporters, resistors, bystanders, and one of the critical elements we pulled out in that is a champion or a supporter. Those are the people in your corner, but you're already spending time and taking energy and with those people right now. And when you embark on this idea of writing a book, you're going to be taking time away from those people, and uh, you need to have them in your corner and have an awareness that they're going to follow you through that process. Or you, and I know this from my own personal experience, you will take people who are supporters or champions, turn them into resistors unknowingly, because you're no longer taking that time and effort with them. So I think it's really important to be clear on that. And we also talked about the things that we can learn from resistors and bystanders, and who these people are and how they are supportive as in across the process from planning to writing, editing, publishing, and marketing your book. Everybody plays a role, and it's important to know who these people are. We also talked about audience and understanding your audience, the message that they need to hear, including your big idea. Paul, you talk about the core pillars, which we'll get into as well. Developing quotes or historical examples so that you can add meat and emphasis and credibility to your message. And then the response, being very clear on what the response is that you want to get from or elicit in your reader. Very, very clear on that. And I think the example that I brought up was, lawyers don't ask questions they don't know answers to. The idea is be painfully obvious
Hmm.
in the point that you want to make.
Yeah, well, and that's as a quick reminder to everyone watching. If you want more detail about the what we just went through, we have a recording of it available. So you can reach out to us via direct message. You can indicate in the chat, and we can make contact with you and get you the link to watch the replay on that if you'd like to hear us go into detail on any of those subjects. But as you're going to see, they're going to play out through the topics we're going to discuss today, and we'll be referring back to them regularly. So stay tuned.
All right. Well, let's dig into this. Today we're talking about the process of writing. We've gone through planning what our book might look like, which is an involved process. Catch that first webinar. If you didn't catch that, send us a direct message on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and we'll be able to get that link to you. But today we're going to talk about writing, and one of the most important things of writing is to structure your creativity. And it sounds like an oxymoron. But I pulled this quote from David Allen, who's the author. He's an author and consultant, and he developed the Getting Things Done method, which is highly effective for a lot of people. I love this quote. It's hard to be fully creative without structure and constraint. Try to paint without a canvas, and that just really stuck in my mind. You want to be creative? Well, you need to have a space defined for your creativity. You need to have boundaries on that space, and that actually increases creativity. And then he talks about creativity and freedom being the opposite sides of the same coin. The best of both worlds. You want freedom, get organized. You want to get organized, get creative. And so we really want to dig into this idea of how do we go about structuring our creativity for writing. And on this slide, I've got rain clouds on there, and I kind of broke one of my rules. I tend to be a little bit black and white on this, but one of my rules here is I've got this rain cloud up here, and I think about this idea of creativity, that that we've got all of these thoughts, and I'll speak for myself. I got all of these thoughts. They are just up in the sky. They're like clouds. And precipitation starts when a little raindrop collides with another little raindrop, more raindrops, until it has enough weight that it comes falling out of the sky, comes falling out of the cloud, and precipitates down. That's what I think of when I think of writing and creativity. All of these thoughts, how do we structure it and have a process by which they collide and precipitate down?
Yeah, and as we'll cover later on as well, the other thing that really is helpful with precipitation is the change in temperature and the change in pressure. And so there is going to be a portion we devote to engaging your spiritual side as a human being. Don't think religious when I say that, think spiritual, right? Your invisible persona, the natural way that we're wired, the natural way that we're built. Creativity needs to occur within a structure. It needs to occur within a sequence. And we'll show you how that works. But just so you're aware, there's not going to be any rain until you vary the what people normally turn into a monotonous process, right? They normally just try and sit down and okay, I'm writing this today and that's it. And that's why they get stuck. That's why, frequently you end up with you're trying to write a whole book and you only get to the first couple of thousand words before you give up.
Absolutely, which I've experienced directly. I get 3,000 words out of my mind, and I'm done. I have no idea why this all connects anyhow. And fortunately, through the principles we're going to outline here, I've learned to overcome that. Now, the first idea is visualize. I love this concept of visualization. Part of what has helped me achieve a lot is having a massive wall calendar. It's about 3 feet by 4 feet. It's just actually sticks on a space in my home that I get to walk by that daily, and that helps me visualize long-term goals. And then I structure. So when I wrote my recent book, I structured out each week and numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then I also created some habits in my life that moved me and created mental space to allow me to move to creating that book. And then I put milestone dates on there as well, so I could see it off in the future. I think that's so important. I'm a technology guy, and I have a lot of stuff, existing in computers and on my phone. But nothing beats for me looking at a wall calendar. We can, if you want a link, I don't have it in front of me, but it comes to my mind that if you want that calendar, I think it's like $20 or something like that. Send me a message and I'll send you the link to that. But that goes along the line of creating space and energy. Now, Paul, you've done a lot of writing with, and so talk to us a little bit about how do we create space and how do we follow our energy so that we can get ourselves in the mood of gathering, scripting, and then refining that information.
Yeah, so I would say one of the things to continue on the thread that I was just on is that there has to be intermission and there has to be variation. And so I remember when you were going through your process, Jason, sometimes you were working in a coffee shop, other times you were working at home, other times you were hearing something coming to you in the middle of the night and you choose to get up and make a record of it rather than go back to sleep. Uh, that's a little risky for me because I'm a very light sleeper, and I'll probably, if I get an alarm in my head going off at 1 o'clock in the morning, that's it. I'm up for the rest of the day. So, but I do keep my phone is nearby, not like right by my nightstand because I do want to get sleep. But if it's that important, I'll get up and I'll grab my phone and I'll type it into the notepad or scribble it on a piece of paper or something like that. But what we're talking about here is not finding new ways to be an insomniac. We're talking about ways to allow that creativity to flow into your life, to flow through your mind and onto your keyboard when it strikes. And very often that is difficult to have happen if you are in a monotonous, repetitive environment over and over again. The other thing I would say, of course, is that this is way easier to do when you are accountable to someone who you do not want to disappoint. And so I feel as though I was that person for you during your process, and you have doubtless been that person for your clients through your one-to-one advisory. The point is, when you have an experienced set of eyes that can think critically and look into the minutia and the details of what you're working on, and that person doubles as your accountability partner, your coach, your advisor, whoever you're working with, a ghostwriter. If that person is constantly looking at what you're writing and evaluating it and questioning, does this really tie in? Is this relevant? Is this what the target reader actually is curious about or wants to know? Are we steering them off down a rabbit hole? All of those things are really important. But what they do for us psychologically is they start to create a muscle memory to where we begin to think like that person. We begin to think like that timeline. And we say, no, I can't dawdle around on Facebook or whatever. I've got to focus on writing because I have a deadline coming up. And that's how professional writers work. So all we're doing here is transferring that same systematic thinking that I have to abide by in my profession to an average person who wants to write a book.
Absolutely. Two pieces of I think foundational concepts as part of that. Number one, you touched on it, this idea of keep a notebook. I have kept a notebook. It's in various forms actually, but I have a journal or a notebook that I keep with me all the time, and I believe that ideas are like gold. And when I find an idea, boy, I just write that thing down, and then I take it one step further. If it was just kind of a sentence, it seemed like a very simple thought. I might write a paragraph to remind myself in the future exactly what that thought is. And then I've got a space that I can go back and review all of those and apply those to future projects. That goes for quotes. We talked about this idea of gathering market research, outlines, content pillars, developing these quotes, all these little touch points, write everything down. And that also gets it out of your mind. So if I wake up in the middle of the night, I've got a space, I can write it down, and now it's out of my mind and I go back to sleep. So I'm not an insomniac. And then, really importantly, for all sorts of things, but particularly for writing a book and moving towards a project, is to focus on accountability.
Yep.
Because having the ability or accountability to meet with a person every week to simply review progress has a way of focusing and prioritizing, uh, so that you do make continual progress. And even if it's, hey, you know what, I'm stuck, you've got a space to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so I would really encourage you, whether it's writing your book or doing anything else, keep a notepad and have weekly accountability towards some sort of defined goal. So the types of things we're looking about structuring here are gathering your market research, your outline, your content pillars, and your questions that we talked about in the planning process, and then scripting questions that we would want to use in some sort of interviewing and recording process with people. And I don't want to gloss over that. It's just one line on this slide, but it's so vitally important, something that you and I have found highly effective. When we've met on video, we record all of our conversations, and then we can use that. We can refer back to that. And we've got some software that does some automatic transcripts and cleans up, and then we can turn that into micro content for marketing and across social media, and you've probably seen some of those. But also you can gather that content together and use it as part of the content writing process in your book or your blogs, or your future work. So record your conversations and be prepared to use those snippets in the future.
Yes, and I want to emphasize, Jason, here the research portion of it, because ultimately what we're trying to do is we're aiming at a target that is very difficult to spot, but it's easier if we're willing to do the homework on the research. And what I mean by that is when you begin to have these conversations with target readers, with experts, with coaches and advisors, and you go through, you're recording a conversation about the research you've done, which we emphasized in part one. And so the questions need to center around, the research that you're showing, the things that people, comments that people are actually leaving in forums or on videos or content that they've seen online. And then you need to channel those into questions that get the people that you're interviewing to speak. And when they do, right, if they say, yes, that problem really resonates with me, I've had that problem before, here's what happened, now you get the story out of them. And then the way you answer can very often be a useful piece of content that you can immediately flip it into the copy that you write for your chapter. And you'll know this, right, by the way your answer impacts them. right? So if this person is a target reader that you're speaking to in that interview and you answered their problem in a way they've never thought of it before and they suddenly have a eureka moment, you're hitting pretty close to the mark. And as you said at the beginning, right, you couldn't be the only one. Well, there's probably other people out there who have that same problem, who haven't thought about it that way, but now that you present it to them that way, the same light bulb will go off in their head when they read it in your book.
Absolutely. And that's where we talk about this idea of noting any answers that feel flat or noting segments that stood out. It's a method of testing. I've done this for years, and I've had maybe the privilege of having a lot of public speaking capacities I've worked in and creating workshops and a lot of sales work as well through the years. And I will test out certain phrases or certain thoughts to see, does that somehow reflect back in a positive way? Are people taking this information and leveraging it in the future? People, I do a bit of advisory work, and one of the things that I'll do is when a person's asking me about something, I will give them a little tidbit of information, and I'll listen in the future. And it's amazing the times that I'll tell them something, and then I hear them saying it to somebody else or saying it back to me from a
Yep.
stage or something like that, which now I know, oh gosh, that's really impactful, because so many times, and we talked about this before, so many times the thing that seems mundane to us is revolutionary
Mm-hmm.
to our reader.
Yeah.
And this story I use on that is 20 something years ago, as a young account executive in an advertising agency. Uh, I did not keep a note list, just like a task list. Instead, I had little Post-it notes.
Yep.
And I would take things I need to do, and I write on a Post-it note, and then, Post-it notes are sticky, so I'd fold it over because I didn't want to collect lint, and I'd stick it in my pocket. And then at the end of the
Right.
day, I'd take those Post-it notes out, and I would look at them and go, "Oh, I didn't do that. Oh, I got that done. Oh, I didn't do that." It's asinine as I look back on it. How did I ever exist without having just a task list? And now task lists are normal, and when I feel overwhelmed, I just boom, create a task list and
Yep.
prioritize it. It's second nature to me. And I had a manager working at a company I owned at one point in time, and he wasn't doing his stuff. And I said, "Hey, where's your task list?" And he stared at me glassy eyed, and and he didn't have a task list. And I thought, oh my gosh, this thing that I've taken for granted, this thing that seems so second nature to me, is new to him. And he's where
Mm-hmm.
I was 20 something years ago. That, I think, underscores this idea of test these pieces of information with your potential audience and figure out, does it resonate? When you hear that sound of resonation, and that idea becomes bigger, more leveraged, that's something that you should really note and make sure to include in your writing.
Particularly if you can phrase it memorably, or like a hook, right? And so in my book, Influencer Networking Secrets, that's what I use for each chapter. And just some examples, right? I'll say, be a magnet, not a pusher. And when I say that, most people who are in business and do some degree of referrals and networking know exactly what I mean, right? Don't be pushy. Don't be a pushy salesperson. Be someone who pulls people towards you. Everybody understands that. I say not for profit is for profit, right? So if you're serving on a board of a nonprofit or if you're a volunteer, expect to profit from it. Not directly, obviously, but expect that, by virtue of the association and the closeness, the proximity that you get with people there, you're going to be the person of choice that they look to in your field of expertise. So it's one of those things, right? If you can couch what is obvious to you but not so obvious to your audience, particularly in a memorable hook like phrase, those can go a long way. I had people repeating those when I wrote the book. They walk around and they'd actually say, "I remembered what you said about not for profit is for profit," and I went and tried it and it worked.
Absolutely. So as we close this idea of structuring your creativity, I do want to emphasize this idea of using tools and becoming a good researcher. Use tools to gather information, become a good researcher, and have some method of compiling that information so that you can refer back to it. I've got a big quotes database that I use. I also am highly structured in my what we call knowledge management. There's a whole profession for knowledge management or information management. But you become a good curator of the knowledge that you have, because then you can refer back to it rather than, that was I remember that quote, but I can't quite recall it. That does you no good when it comes to passing this information on. You want to be a good public speaker, you want to be a good blog writer, you want to be a good salesperson, you want to be good at writing, become a good curator of information. We're going to be doing a workshop actually on tools to use, tools to manage knowledge so that you can refer back to that. Become good at that. If you need assistance with that, send us a private message and we'll be happy to get you information on that workshop in the future. We need to move along here
Yep.
because one of the pieces we're coming up right now is staggering your creativity and this idea of the open loop template and outline. So let me review this real quickly. You're gonna have an ABC process when you get actually into writing. So let's say we've gathered our information, we've got it all in these clouds. Now we're gonna join these pieces together and we're gonna precipitate them out. Let me help you demystify this process with ABCs. You've got the open loop template and your outline, which you're gonna start in the evening, and then you're going to go to bed and you're going to rest and allow your subconscious to begin doing work. And then you're going to write the next day a draft that you decided you were going to focus on the night before. Paul, this open loop template, I know we're going to do a future workshop on this because it's so important, but dig into this and help demystify what is this open loop template.
Yeah. So anytime you see a before and after photo of somebody who went through a transformation from being like 300 pounds down to 180, you know something happened in the middle, right? And what was that thing in the middle? That's part of what we're talking about. So there's a condition that you're in right now as a writer, and that is you're stuck. You can't get any movement. You get to a certain word count, and that's it. And you forget what you were writing about. That's the before part, right? Now we're going to change the game and we're going to integrate, right, the research. We're going to do those interviews. We're going to compile all that knowledge in a useful manner that we can then channel into writing. But we're going to observe a principle laid down in the ancient wisdom, which is there was evening and then there was morning, and then creative work took place. And then there was another evening and morning, and creative work took place. So we're observing a pattern laid down for us saying this is how creative work is done. You create, then you rest. And you create, and you rest, right? Simple. The combination of that accumulated knowledge with the changes in pressure and temperature, right? When you rest at night, you take the pressure off because you go to sleep. So you stop worrying. You trust that you're going to wake up the next morning, and that takes the pressure off of you. Then you also change the temperature. I don't know if you've noticed it. This certainly happens to me. I sleep hot at night, so I have to throw the blankets off for a while and then pull them back on. That's a physical example of what's also going on in the spiritual side of me, which is that I'm changing the temperature. I'm changing the pressure. That's going to cause that moisture to accumulate and get to a temperature where it can fall. And so when you wake up in the morning, you're refreshed, you've had a good night's sleep, your subconscious has had an opportunity to operate on all the stuff that you outlined the night before. And you sit down in that environment, that space with that energy that we've talked about creating, and you block everything else out and you execute. I promise you, if you do it this way, it's going to work a lot differently and a lot better than if you just bam, sit down at a desk. Okay, now I got to write, and then you get stuck.
Absolutely. This is not a new concept. We're applying it to writing, but in terms of task management and becoming an effective professional, a lot of people espouse the idea of writing out your tasks the night before you go leave the office or wind down for the day. Review the day, write down the things you do plan to do tomorrow. And what it does is it, like you're talking about, wipes out, it takes all the pressure out of the air and clears your mind, and so that you hit the ground running the next day. You feel more effective the next day. And it has a magical way of working because we pair that with another principle, which I'm sure we've all experienced. And I just experienced it the other day. I blurted out a name. I was sitting with my parents at a party and I blurted out a name out of the blue for a person I had been trying to think of 3 days prior.
Mm-hmm.
Our subconscious has a way of working on problems in the background. And if
Yep.
you've ever remembered something hours or days later that you were desperately thinking of, that's the same principle which is at work when we outline and direct our energy, direct our subconscious towards the problem, particularly if we're thinking of in terms of questions, like what questions do I want to answer? and then your brain will put it together. And when you begin again, start that precipitation process, those droplets will be bigger. Those thoughts will be more condensed, and you will
Mhm.
find that they will drop right onto the page. It's highly effective.
And I want to add a caveat here. As you are actually in the execution, I don't know if you've ever stood and watched drops fall. Most people have. If you observe what they do when they hit the ground, is they don't try and jump back up into the sky and arrange a better fall. So neither should you. I want you to take a rest after you finish. In fact, I encourage people to set a 60 to 90-minute timer and don't overdo it, right? If you are operating in flow state and you've done your outline and you've had a good night's sleep, you should be able to get through 2,500 to 3,500 word chapter in an hour after some practice with this. Right? I know this because the writers on my team have told me that's what to do since I taught how to do this. My point is, once you get done with that, that is a rough draft, and leave it as a rough draft. Do not go back and edit it. Walk away for another 24 hours, then come back. Why? Because the next day, your subconscious will have been ruminating on everything you wrote, and you'll come across stories as you begin to try and edit and say, did I communicate effectively here? And you'll realize, oh, there's more to say about this that I forgot. I completely didn't have that on my mind yesterday. Now I do, because you've multiplied, right, the focus and intensity you're putting on those stories. And so it'll come back to you, but only if you abide by that work rest rule. If you try and do it all in one setting, it's not going to work.
Absolutely. And along with that, I want to mention this idea of habits and circle back, in fact, on this idea of space and energy. So much of our lives are built on habits that when we get in the habit of directing our energies, then resting, and then writing, our brain will catch up and we'll get in this idea of, oh, I go to this space and now here's what occurs. Oh, I write. I precipitate out these thoughts that have been ruminating in my head or circling around. The process of becoming good at anything is really developing good habits. It's like a muscle memory, right?
Correct.
Uh, and writing is really no different. So I like that. I love the idea of being diligent about creating habits around the writing. It will make writing quite a bit easier for you.
Absolutely. Yep.
So now we're moving on to this idea of scrubbing your creativity. So let's say we've gone through this process of creating a space. We've got all of our questions. We've done some interviews with people. We have micro content. We've got segments of content. All these disparate things. We have now then created an outline or focused our direction in our mind, allowed the subconscious to do the work and start solving for some of these problems. Now we've precipitated these words out onto a page, and we've not really dissected it much because, like you're talking about, you don't have to have those raindrops come back up. Just allow them to fall down and let them soak in. So we come to this idea of scrubbing it now, or we could call it a review process. And we want to use our eyes and ears for that, which is so critical. And I'm glad that Paul, when we were putting this together, you mentioned this idea that we don't want to think of our book as just words on a page. We do
Hmm.
want to engage our other senses in this, and particularly with reading our own manuscript out loud.
Yep. Yep. If I could pound on the table without being obnoxious inside a webinar, I would. If I could say it 3 times over and over again in some really annoying voice so that would stick with you, I would read what you've written aloud. And here's why. So you may not know this, but the human eyes, require software in the brain to interpret what we naturally look at upside down. And I owe this to my mentor, Rabbi Daniel Lapin. I've heard him explain it. It's brilliant, but I'm going to try and paraphrase it. And that is, um, the eyes are naturally flipped upside down, so that what you're looking at, if you read it silently, you can often gloss over words. That's why if you've ever read a book twice, the second time you read it is not the same as the first. You notice things that you didn't notice before. That's because our eyes skip over details like that. The ears are different. The ears are actually the center of balance and equilibrium. And if you ever lose your hearing, you'll find out what that means, right? If you don't have your ears working, it makes it more difficult. You're more unstable physically. You would think that would be in the hips or the toes, the ankles. No, it's in the ears. Why? Because the ears are much better at judging and interpreting the content that's coming into them than the eyes are. Now, I'm not saying don't use your eyes. Obviously, you can't read without them. What I am saying is don't read without your ears. I'm saying if you read that content aloud, you will begin to hear exactly what we've outlined there. Errors with grammar and syntax, run-on sentences, not enough detail, too much detail. All these things that pop up and that a professional editor is trained to see, you can eliminate a bunch of that ahead of time and find much more satisfaction in what you've written, and add on the stuff that you forgot to put in. Take out the stuff that you suddenly see, I don't know what I was talking about. That has no place in there. It just makes for a much more satisfying experience. But if I could ring some kind of bell and get people to learn that, this is one of the most fundamentally huge assets, gifts I ever learned as a professional writer. Read it back to yourself out loud.
Absolutely. I've been a believer in that for many years, long before you and I met. It has helped me out in so many situations because my eyes will gloss over all sorts of things, and I'm a pretty big stickler for grammar and punctuation and spelling and all that stuff. But when I read it out loud, I'll catch those little things that my eyes have moved past because I wrote it, right? And it really, in particular, the types of things we're talking about, it's not just grammar, syntax, punctuation, but this idea of active and versus passive voice, which I'd like to touch on in a minute. But incoherence, these topics that don't have a resolution, or
Mhm.
assumptions. I think this is a real critical one, that when we're telling stories, we might be leaving out important details
Mhm.
that we
Yep.
assume we were there when the actions occurred 15 years ago. Now we're trying to recount this story, but we left out all the important parts that lead us to the resolution and why it's important. Reading with reading with a critical eye for assumptions, I think, is important. And it also gets in this idea of starting to use that support system, having them read some of these things, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, but having them read some of these, having them read our manuscript really, so that they go, wait a second, I don't quite understand. Okay,
Yeah.
well, use that information and go back and make sure that you're not leading with assumptions, and then disconnected stories or examples that don't fit. For me, I'm a big believer in using examples. I think John Maxwell talks about it. Never tell a story without making a point, and never make a point without telling a story. The
Yep.
same is true in your book, but you're gonna put these stories in there. Upon rereading it, maybe the third time, you're like, you know what, this just doesn't resonate. It does not concentrate towards my end goal. Maybe there's a better story that will fit. And that's where it goes back to making sure that you're a good knowledge manager, or getting input from other people so that they can be a good critic for you, uh, to make sure it's as good a writing as you can do, and you're absolutely proud of it, and it works towards your end goal before you get to the editing and publishing process.
Yeah, I heartily concur. I call it the "you had to be there" rule, right? And if you went to high school where I did back in the '90s, and you walked up on a group of your friends and they were laughing and joking about something, and you said, "What's so funny?" They would have sometimes they'd say, "You had to be there," right? Because they understood that I didn't have enough context of the situation because I hadn't been with them, and so they would tell a joke and they knew it would fall flat. And I felt kind of excluded and offended by that. But then they told me, "Yeah, you just weren't there. We're not hiding the joke from you. You just wouldn't understand it unless we explained it to you." So that's one of my um, memorable phrases. I say that's you had to be there rule. The other thing though, um, I just actually just had this happen recently with a client. We were working on a book. I was doing like developmental editing for him, and he had this really good commentary on a proverb, and the proverb was right. The commentary was generally right, but he referenced a recognizable song from pop culture,
Mm.
a song that you would think, why wouldn't you stick that in there, because everybody's going to see it and recognize the title and recognize the artist. But the when I looked at the lyrics of the song, I was like, yeah, but that song has nothing to do with what you're talking about. And so we had to pull it back out and find one that did work. And so then you take the risk that maybe not everybody knows the one that does work. Well, then maybe you got to spell it out, right? And again, that takes you back to the "you had to be there" rule. If that content is not instantly recognizable, right? In other words, most people don't recognize the lyrics, may not even know the artist, haven't heard the song before. Well, then you got to take even more time to spell it out for them. And that goes back to that importance of not assuming an intimate understanding with a stranger who is reading your book.
Absolutely. So this idea of active versus passive voice when we're reading our manuscript back to ourselves, I know that maybe this is confusing for people. What is active voice and what is passive voice, and why is it so important that we keep an eye on that?
Yeah, simple example, right? Jason walked the dog. Okay, that's active voice. The dog was walked by Jason. That's passive voice. Now, the problem is you hear me on this webinar, you see my face, you hear my voice, you can see my body language, you can hear my tonality. There's no confusion. Paper's not the same way, especially with people who don't know you personally and you're trying to get them to get to know you personally. So when you put passive voice on paper, people's eyes glaze over if they read it. They get confused, they start wandering, and you lose them, right? It's a function of our psychology. Passive creates opportunities for wandering, active does not. Active says pay attention. Active says now this happened, then this happened, then there's a string, there's a sequence, there's a pattern that people follow. And with my team, right, we write content for a bunch of people. We'll write blogs and emails and stuff like that. And we have a running joke: you're in the passive voice. You're in the passive voice corner. We caught you using passive voice, right? But that's really because I want them to avoid it like the plague. There are instances where you absolutely cannot say it any other way. I get that. But what you should be scanning for is a 99% or better absence. I mean, 99% or better active voice throughout your manuscript.
Yeah, and I found that to be effective. That sometimes it's useful to break up some of the monotony. But a corollary I look into from outside writing is interpersonal communication. Active tends to be assertive, tends to be direct. Some people can read into that as though they are being confrontational or too direct, as if someone would call you up and say, "Hey, you want to go to dinner?" And you say, passive would be like, "Yeah, sure, if you'd like to,"
Hmm. Yeah.
rather than "Yes, I do."
Yes.
That's the feeling that I think some people, when they look at active voice, they read the "Yes, I do," and if you look at your own interpersonal communication, you might find that you're pretty passive individual. Whereas in our writing specifically, we want to write actively. We want to be assertive about our message,
Yes.
and that might come up against somebody's kind of internal dialogue of, "Am I being confrontational?" The answer is no, you're not. You're being direct, and that's what you want to go for. Be very
Yes.
clear in your message. If it's a message worth sharing, be clear. Be painfully obvious. So this
And
is an iterative. Go ahead.
don't forget, right, from what we said at the top, stark clarity destroys ambiguity. Certainty is people buy certainty, confidence. If they're interacting with you via your book, and they're saying, I could do business with this person, I want to get into this person's funnel, I want to know more about them, that's because there's no confusion about who you are, what you stand for, and how you can help them. So
Absolutely. This is an iterative process, and I want to invite people to think about this not as linear. I think for people who are just starting out on this journey of writing a book, I think people think, well, I'm just going to write this outline, I'm going to gather all these things, and I'm going to write the whole thing, and I'm going to get to the end of it. And I think this idea of thinking it has to be linear prevents people from moving forward because this is iterative. And what I mean by that is a lot of times this process circles back on itself. So uh, we're focusing right now. We've already focused on planning, and I didn't include that on that slide here. But we have a plan, but now we're developing a structure behind writing. Then we get into the staggered writing process. Then we scrub it, and that might lead us back. Many times, I think it does lead us back to refining our structure.
mhm.
It's as if we were to build a road that's 100 miles long. We'll start off in the direction of our destination, but we check it periodically and readjust. We maybe had to go around a certain area because we couldn't move, couldn't just destroy that and move through. So we will adjust so that in the end, we are more clear. we're more concentrated, we hit our destination, but that many times means circling back, even inviting, redoing our outline. Maybe we
Yep.
wrote some stuff and it's like, man, that doesn't work at all. This does not concentrate my point. I'm diluted in my message. Now we might want to redo that outline entirely before we get to the editing, and before we get to publishing. And then way off in the future, we got marketing off in the future. But also, I want to emphasize as part of this iterative process that when we begin with the end in mind, we're eventually going to market this book. It might seem so distant off in the future, but we're developing content. If we go back to that interviewing process where we're recording our interviews, now we've got some micro content that we can use as part of the marketing process, even before our book is finished. It helps
Yep.
in writing the book, but it also helps in advertising the book as well.
Yeah, all part of synergizing your creativity, right? And if you've been watching from the top, from the beginning of the webinar, you might have noticed that we use footage of an airplane taking off and in flight and then landing. And it's the perfect analogy because airplanes have to be engineered to 100% fail-safe specifics in order to make the snuff to get up in the air. However, to get to their destination, once they're off the ground, they constantly have to course correct. They're everlastingly going off of where they want to go. And if you're off by, just a few inches, I don't know what measurement they use, but, just slightly off course in where you're heading. In other words, you take off from Seattle, SeaTac, near where I live, to go to O'Hare, near where Jason lives, but you're even just 1 degree off, you'll end up in St. Louis or Miami or wherever wherever. You might end up in a farm field somewhere. So the whole point is we're using both precise, linear, repeatable processes, and we are integrating a constant refreshing, a constant organic development, shall we say, of what you're writing about. Because as you said, Jason, you're going to come to points where you realize all of a sudden, you know what, this entire section has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I'm going to have to put it on the cutting floor document, as I call it, and maybe we use it for something else later.
Absolutely. And that idea of synergizing your creativity is working outside of yourself, engaging that support system so that you make sure that the direction, like you're talking about, is really on point to your destination. So we received input. We have an idea of where we want to head, but we received input from our target audience. We asked them questions. We recorded all of that information. Now we've gone through that iterative process of writing. We now have our champions and our supporters. We've got our perhaps our resistors, which we've learned some information from. We've got our bystanders who are just waiting for us to do something remarkable. We've got content now that we can repurpose either in video or audiograms, and people have probably seen that out there. And if you don't know what the audiogram is or anything, just message me. I'll be happy to walk you through it. But we repurpose also segments of chapters. We've got quotes of our own that we can use, which we can create imagery for, and we perhaps review with experts the content that we have, and then seek their contribution is in terms of maybe a forward or endorsements for the book, particularly across social media. Social media is there's two primary types of social media. I won't get in the weeds on this too far, but there are interest-based social media like TikTok, where people of similar interests are grouped together. And then there's relationships like Instagram, where you're going to see content of the people who you're connected with. And then some bridge the gap, like LinkedIn. It's partially interest-based, but it's highly connection-based. And in that case, we've got all these little pieces of content, snippets out there, which lead to credibility, which lead to people engaging with our channel more, which lead to the purchase of the book, and the engagement perhaps with our sales process when we've got that out in the wild. And then we've got some peer credibility from the contributors and the other experts who've been part of our writing process from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes a village, in other words. And what I find the most exciting about doing it in using this approach is that you have the opportunity, even though there is a linear process towards, you got to plan it, then you got to write it, then you do editing, then you do publishing, then you do marketing, right? And that appears sequential. It's also an ascending spiral. So you always got to be planning for editing and publishing and marketing. You've always got to be doing planning. You've always got to be revising planning, and you've always got to be doing writing and rewriting and rethinking how you're writing. The great thing, though, about synergizing your creativity is that if you're recording all of those interviews anyway, you now have content that you can test it. You can float it out there on social media. You can see whether or not people respond to it. And in these webinars and in our background planning sessions that you and I have been doing, Jason, we've done just that, right? We've drunk our own Kool-Aid, and we've said, let's put this stuff out on social media and let's see what kind of response we get to it. And so we created audiograms based on recordings of our conversations, and lo and behold, people who represent the kind of person we'd like to eventually do business with was popping up and commenting on them and saying, that's really helpful. Yes, I understand it better now. Boy, you know, that part, I didn't think of that at all before I was writing a book. It's gonna be the same thing with what you're talking about. So if you're writing a book, let's just say you're writing a book about, you know, keeping more of your money and not paying as much in taxes, right? Okay, well, then you can have an interaction with a financial planner. You can have an interaction with a tax attorney. You can have an interaction with a business advisor, or you can have an interaction with a target reader, somebody who is looking for better strategies on how to keep more of their money. At some point during that conversation, there's going to be a poignant moment, a flow state moment of interaction between you and that person that can, if you can chop that into a 45 to 120-second soundbite, video bite that you can put online, you can test to see whether people respond to it. And I always add the caveat here that just because nobody responds to it doesn't mean it's bad. But on the other hand, if people do respond to it, and particularly if it's people who you can look at their profile and say, that's somebody I would like to read my book, that's somebody I'd like to do business with. If those people are resonating and they're commenting on it, you got a winner.
Absolutely. And as part of this process, I really want to emphasize that it's going to take courage. It takes courage to write a book and put yourself out there, but it also takes a lot of courage to go through the process of planning and engaging with experts. Initially, asking questions, recording. It's a process of being assertive, and then it's going to take additional work when we get to the end of, or near the end of writing our book, and we're going to send our manuscript to somebody and say, "Hey, I need you to read this." And I remember from my book, I put out some manuscripts in the editing process, and just to a handful of people, and I said, "I'd just like you to read this thing and tell me what resonates." And one person gave me a scathing review.
Yep.
And then another person who read the book shortly after said, "This book changed my life, and I think about I think about my life in a different way." And and that's okay. That's okay, but don't give too much weight to either one of those extremes.
Yep.
Develop the courage to put yourself out there, develop the courage to get your message out there, and be willing. I think it's very, very key. If this is your first book, be willing for your first book to be terrible. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Your second book will get better, and your third book get better. Become diligent about the habit of writing, and you will get better as time goes on. You might start off great. That's I don't know where everybody's at, but be courageous and be assertive, which gets us to one of these next steps, which is determining whether you're going to get a professional editor or you're going to go the traditional publishing route or a hybrid publisher. We're going to get into that a little bit later in the editing and publishing sections. We're going to do another webinar as we move forward. But Paul, what are some considerations that somebody might want to be thinking about while they're writing, and then thinking down the line?
Certainly, the more you want to go with a hybrid or traditional publishing house, the more subject your work is going to be to. It absolutely has to be professionally edited, because they're not going to want to put out something there that is obviously full of casual writer's mistakes. And I say that not in any critical way in any direction, because even top flight publishing traditional outlets, occasionally typos get by, occasionally an extra word gets left out or put in, right? So it's not about being absolutely flawless. It's about making it as difficult as possible for the reader to be confused or bored or misled, or not misled intentionally, but just led down a rabbit hole and that kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons, though I'm not defending this, I'm just stating it, that traditional publishing houses, the McGraw-Hills and the Houghton Mifflins of the world, retain the right to overwrite 75% of your content. They are very concerned that if they do get that book into bookstores and it does go off the shelves, that it sells more, even more as a result. And so they naturally want that book to sell, as does a hybrid publisher. But a hybrid usually allows you much greater creative control. But in either case, I'm going to tell you right then and there, automatically plan on professional editing, whether it's included in their package or whether you have to hire it for yourself. Usually you have to hire it for yourself. From my part as a professional writer, I would never publish a book without uh, putting a member of my team or a professional editor I trust on top of that manuscript. Why? Because a publisher, even if certainly a hybrid or traditional publisher, has a list of publishing manuscript guidelines that they're going to want you to follow. They're going to want the paragraphs indented in a certain space, spaced apart a certain way, arranged a certain way on a document, because that creates far fewer problems for them in the formatting process, which is where they get it laid out and templated on the pages of the actual print copy, the digital copy. So there's all these little steps, right, that go from when you finish that manuscript and you say, no mas. If you got it in a Google Doc, you got it in a Word doc, doesn't matter. You're going to have another bunch of hurdles to clear. A professional editor will be a great resource for you in doing that, particularly if you have those guidelines. You can say, here's how they want it.
Right.
Can you do that? So,
And we've got resources for that. If anybody's looking for uh, assistance with what to do with your manuscript, you need some editor to take a look at it. We've got resources for that. And I want to encourage you. It's no secret that we are doing this because we think we've got resources which can help you in terms of your own writing and content creation. We've got other webinars that we're doing as well, and launching podcasts or doing online video. But we've got the free global community. It's on Facebook. Look for the Thinker Growth community, or you can DM us. We'll be happy to send you the link for that. Other like-minded creators and peers who are looking to change the world with their content. And then if you are really looking to jumpstart your growth, you're looking to jumpstart your writing, we've got the book strategy series. It's 3 90-minute strategy calls. You'll get your outline, you'll get your reader's journey map, your core pillars will be defined, and you can be well on your way to writing. And then if you get stuck at any point in time, you can come back and book another 3 strategy calls. However, if you are in the mood to just do soup to nuts, you've got an idea and you want to get it done over the course of 18 weeks and published, that's your idea to done 18-week coaching. It's expert guidance. You'll have a written strategy. You're going to weekly calls and accountability. And then you'll have your outline, your journey map, your core pillars, and your self-publishing guidelines or introduction to publishers, or we can help you get your book published as well. Want to encourage you to engage with any of those, depending on where you're at in your journey. And as we wind down here, Paul, any final thoughts from you?
this is an iterative process, as you said, Jason. And I was thinking of your presentation you gave a while back on the founding of the U.S. Constitution and how few people actually ended up uh, signing their names on the Declaration of Independence versus the version we get today has all those signatures on it, but the original didn't. It had very few. And I think that's an apt analogy, just to point out that very few people actually get from start to finish on this. Fewer than 1% of the population, despite all the millions of titles that are available on Amazon, very few people can actually see it through. So it is a matter of being diligent and having staying power to go through all these things. However, the more you do it in a community, in a village, right, of professionals who can help you, the more those obstacles just fall down one after the other, and you get to the finish line and you are a published author. And that adds a degree of credibility and authority to your brand and your name that wasn't there before. People will look at you differently. Even if they don't read your book, they'll look at you differently. And so it's a very good reason in my mind to follow through on it.
Well said. Well, thank you for joining us for this webinar on writing your book. Our goal is to get those who have an idea and those who want to start writing to get to finish, get it to done. We've got some solutions for you. I'm going to put those on the screen as we wind down here. Thanks for joining us. If you want more information, feel free to direct message us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook. Join the free community on Facebook, the Thinker Growth community. We've got resources there and accountability for you, and we will see you next time. Thanks for joining us.